Iran, the nationwide protests triggered by the death of a young woman arrested for allegedly breaching Iran's strict dress code has focused attention on the role of women in Iranian society. But the fight for women's rights in Iran didn't start only today. In the mid-1950s, a young Iranian woman by the name of Forugh Farrokhzad published a series of poems that sent shockwaves through Persian society.
Let me lose myself in you, till no one can find my trace. Let your dewy sighs, fevered soul, waft over the body of my songs.
Known only by her first name, Forugh, in Iran she dared to put female desire centre stage in her work. By refusing to conform to what society deemed appropriate for a woman, she came into conflict with the moral climate of her time. Hello, I'm Bridget Kendall, and you're listening to The Forum from the BBC World Service. And today we're going to take a closer look at this influential Iranian figure who remains an icon in Iran over 50 years after her death. Her private life was just as dramatic and compelling as her poetry. It was the source of endless fascination for the public in her short lifetime. She died aged 32 in a car accident. And the interest in her life has threatened to overshadow her achievements as a poet and then filmmaker, her one documentary film a tantalising glimpse of what might have been. In the decades since her death in 1967, Forugh's life and poetry have become a symbol of resistance and emancipation for many Iranians. Anti-government protesters in 2009, to take just one example, used lines from her poems on placards as they marched through the streets of the capital, Tehran. To explore Forugh Farrokhzad, I'm joined by three expert guests. Sholeh Wolpé is writer-in-residence at the University of California, Irvine. She's a poet, playwright, librettist and translator of Forugh's work. And it's her translations we'll be using throughout the programme from a volume published by the University of Arkansas Press. In San Francisco in the United States is the author Jasmin Darznik, Associate Professor and Chair of the Creative Writing Programme at California College of the Arts. Her novel, Song of a Captive Bird, is a reimagining of Forugh's life inspired by her poetry, interviews and correspondence. And also in the United States is Levi Thompson, Assistant Professor of Persian and Arabic Literature in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. He's the author of Reorienting Modernism in Arabic and Persian Poetry. Welcome to all three of you. And before we look at Forugh's life and work, Sholeh and Jasmin, I'd like to turn to you first to understand what her poems mean for you personally, as Iranians. You were both born in Iran and, like many families there, left the country as it was going through a period of huge political turmoil. So, Sholeh, what's your take on this?
Well, I knew Forugh Farrokhzad's work when I was a very young girl in Iran. And her poems in my household were forbidden to me because my father said they were too mature for me. But I did steal a book from my aunt's library, and I read it at night and hid the book under my mattress. And that is the sole surviving possession I have today from Iran. Her poetry was magnificent, even to a 13-year-old child.
Well, that's very powerful memory and thought. Jasmin, what about you? Was it a similar experience for you?
It was. We left Iran just before the revolution in 1978. My family came with 2 suitcases, and my mother had brought a book of Forugh's poems, the only book she brought from Iran, and put it in one of those suitcases. There is a picture of her on the front cover. She has bobbed hair and kohl-lined eyes, and she looked so glamorous and mysterious. And even though I couldn't read her poems as a child growing up in America, I was obsessed with her. I thought she was fascinating. And as soon as I got to college, I started reading her poetry and was completely possessed by her voice. It was so modern and so fresh, and I felt like it was speaking directly to me.
Well, that certainly gives us a hint of what she represents for many in the Iranian diaspora. And inside Iran, Forugh was and still is an iconic figure, not only thanks to her eventful life, but also because of the status accorded to Persian poets and poetry. Levi, can you give a sense of that reverence within Iran for poetry and the pivotal role it plays? I've seen it described as a religion for Iranians, a religion as powerful as Islam. Is that right?
It certainly is, in many respects. The place of poetry in, for instance, the United States, where I live, is not at all like it is in Iran. We hear about poetry maybe every 4 years at the presidential inauguration, and then for the rest of American culture, poetry is largely sidelined, elite. It's very disconnected from daily life. It couldn't be more different in Iran, where poetry is really part of everyday life for everybody, from elites to uneducated people. Poetry readings are televised. The government is interested in poetry and poetic production. People are familiar with poetry. They're taught classical Persian poetry by very famous poets like Rumi, Saadi, Hafez, and so on.
Were these all male poets, though, these classical Persian poets? Or did people read Persian poetry by women?
There are some examples of pre-modern women poets that people did read some of. There are not many. Poetry has largely been dominated by men, both in the pre-modern period and in contemporary Iran as well.
So growing up in the 1940s, Forugh presumably would have read many of the standard texts of Persian poetry.
Yes, so she came from a fairly strict family. Both her mother and father were fairly strict with the children, but she was still surrounded by poetry at home. And even though she didn't receive very much formal education, leaving school around the age of 14, at home, poetry was part of her family's life. There are points in her autobiographical comments where she mentions her father reading the Book of Kings, the Shahnameh by Ferdowsi, who's another of these very important pre-modern Persian poets.
She immersed herself in books then, but Sholeh, she was an active child too, wasn't she?
Yes.
Spirited, I think is the word some people have used.
She certainly was. She was unusual. She was one of 7 children where boys got more attention from their father. And she was always competing with that. And in her own way, the way she competed physically. Like she behaved like boys, she ran out, she did all kinds of like misbehaving that boys did at the time. And she was completely unrepentant about it. But in a way, it was a child's way hungering for attention from her father and mother, who was actually quite abusive.
As a young woman, she was expected to settle down and have children, which indeed she did, marrying a relative and having a son when she was still only in her mid-teens. But she had begun to write poetry, which she was determined to see in print. So, Jasmin, how did she manage to do this? Was it easy for a woman to publish in Iran in the 1950s?
Not at all. Definitely not under her own name, and not the kind of poems that Forugh was writing. Initially, her husband, who himself had been a writer, he'd written some and published some work himself, encouraged her, but it became a real point of tension in the marriage. She started to travel from where they were living in Ahvaz to Tehran, the capital. She started to meet with editors in the city and publishers. And I imagined one of these scenes in my novel where she shows up at an editor's office and the editor dismisses her outright. You know, he thinks it's laughable that a woman would show up and insist on showing her poems to him. And when she gets home, she's upbraided by her husband and her in-laws, who are scandalized by the fact that she's making these trips back and forth to Tehran from Ahvaz, and more to the point that she was writing about herself in such an unabashed way.
Tell us more about what kind of poetry she was writing.
She was writing what we would call confessional poetry now, maybe. That is the word we would use. She was writing from her life. She was writing about critically women's sexuality from a woman's point of view, from her own point of view. And this had never been done in Iran. So it was utterly shocking to everyone who encountered it.
Well, we're beginning to build up a picture of a woman who was prepared to go her own way, even if that risked damage to her reputation. And her reputation certainly took a battering when one of her early poems, Sin, appeared, which clearly referred to an adulterous relationship. Sholeh, can you read an extract for us, please?
Okay, yes. I have sinned a rapturous sin in a warm and flamed embrace, sinned in a pair of vindictive arms, arms violent and ablaze. In that quiet, vacant dark, I looked into his mystic eyes, found such longing that my heart fluttered impatient in my breast. In that quiet, vacant dark, I sat beside him punch-drunk. His lips released desire on mine. Grief unclenched my crazy heart.
An extract from Sin by Forugh Farrokhzad. Sholeh, for 1950s Iran, this was nothing short of scandalous, right?
Yes, of course. When Sin appeared in a magazine, people were shocked by it, but they were also very excited about it. A lot of people wrote into the magazine saying, why are you publishing this whore? She's misguiding our young. But at the same time, everybody was fascinated by her and by her courage, because what she was doing at this point, she was writing exactly like the way men were writing. Men were always writing from a perspective of a woman. But this was the first time a woman was writing from her own perspective, not only emotionally and spiritually, but also sexually. And this poem celebrated that. When she writes about it, she says, yes, I have sinned and I have drunk alcohol. And, oh, well, what about it? And of course, when the poem came out, every man wanted to be the man in the poem. And a lot of men claimed that they were the man in the poem that she was talking about.
So in terms of content, this was really breaking some taboos about what you should write about. But it was also revolutionary, wasn't it? Stylistically. Jasmin, tell us about that.
It was transgressive, I think, because it seemed on the surface to wear a kind of traditional costume. It's in quatrains with rhyming couples. Forugh hadn't yet moved to free verse. So on the face of it, it looked like a conventional love poem. But if you start to read it, you knew right away that it wasn't. The usual metaphors for sex were dispensed with. She was using really direct language. She was using the I, so that confessional I, and talking about desire in this very direct way from a woman's point of view.
Levi, looking at it as part of the Persian poetry tradition, what do you think made such an impact? One biographer I read said she reversed 1,000 years of Persian literature.
So we've mentioned the confessional tone in this poem and also the language, which is somewhat more accessible, more direct, more colloquial, closer to the common tongue and diction. And some folks read this as autobiographical expression. And because it's coming from a woman, that challenges a status quo that had been standard in Persian poetry for a long time. In the pre-modern Persian poetic tradition, we find the objectification of the beloved, whether that's a woman, beardless youth, the cupbearer. The beloved in earlier Persian poetry has no voice. So Forugh turns that on its head by voicing feminine desire in her poetry.
In spite of all the criticism and the controversy, or perhaps because of it, Forugh established herself as a new voice in Persian poetry. She achieved the kind of success no other female poet in Iran had managed, even if the critics insisted on calling her a poetess. Let's hear another extract, this time from the poem Only Voice Remains. Sholeh, can you read for us again, please?
Why should I stop? Why? Birds have gone to seek their blue way. The horizon is horizontal. Movement vertical, a gushing geyser. Bright stars spin as far as the eye can see. The earth repeats itself in space. Air tunnels become connecting canals, and day changes to an entity so vast it cannot be stuffed into the narrow imaginations of the newspaper worms. Why should I stop? The path meanders among life's tiny veins, and the climate of the moon's womb will annihilate the cancerous cells. And in the chemical aura of after dawn, there will remain only voice seeping into time. Why should I stop?
That was an extract from Only Voice Remains, translated from the original Persian by one of our guests, Sholeh Wolpé. So, Forugh achieved professional success early on, but meanwhile, Sholeh, her personal life was falling apart, wasn't it?
Yes, of course. She divorced her husband, and because she had sexual affairs, or they said she did, they took her son away, and the son was raised by her husband's family, and they told the son, your mother has left you for poetry, she is having sexual affairs, she doesn't love you, and this destroyed her.
Clearly, becoming a poet not only meant damage to Forugh's reputation, it also involved great personal sacrifice as well. Do we know what she went through, Sholeh?
She fell into great depression and she tried to commit suicide. And then eventually she was hospitalized and underwent electric shock therapy. But she had to go on. Her love was poetry, and she was getting better and better, and her work was maturing more and more.
Forugh certainly went to some dark places in her life. Jasmin, you've written a novel based on her story, so what was it like for you to reimagine her?
Challenging. She's so iconic to Iranians, so beloved, and handling her life came with a lot of responsibility. She did go to dark places, but that's why it felt imperative to go there with her and tell about those moments in her life. I think it was all of this adversity that contributed to her greatness. It built her character, it made her strong, it helped her break totally new ground as a writer and as a woman. She was also a really fun character to write because she was so gutsy and confident, which I think we all want to be. I certainly do. And she was such a soulful woman too. She had great spirit and a great life force in her. So I really cherished the time that I spent with her as I wrote the novel.
Forugh continued to write poetry, publishing 4 collections in her short lifetime. Levi, how did her work change over the course of her career?
Stylistically, she matured over those years. She took on a much more universal voice. She adopted the forms of free verse, breaking away from earlier metrical conventions and conventions of rhyme as well. She clearly demonstrates an absolute knowledge of and expertise with using classical metrical forms, which were imported into Persian from Arabic. So this is also interesting as far as cross-cultural relations go. And she's doing this in a highly modernist way, something that had been pioneered by earlier Iranian poets, most specifically Nima Yushish, who dies in 1960. But Forugh takes these changes and incorporates them into her poetry in a way that connects her work with the other Iranian modernists, but also with modernism as a more global, broader, planetary movement.
What was it that made her style modernist?
So she connects her themes with those that we find in, for instance, European modernism. So we might mention T.S. Eliot, the early 20th century Anglo-American poet, and his famous Wasteland from 1922. Forugh makes some direct references to Eliot. She also makes direct references to modernists from within the Persian tradition as well, with her formal changes that she introduces by taking not the entire line of poetry as her metrical base, but rather just a piece of it, the poetic foot. So if we're thinking about Shakespeare, that would be an iamb, and repeating a foot as many times as she needs or not for the meaning of a line. And I can give us an example of this as well from the Persian and then from Sholeh's English translation. I think we can hear how this works if we'd like to hear that.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So this is from Let Us Believe in the Beginning of the Cold Season, which was posthumously published in the 1970s, several years after Farrokh's death. So here it is. در آستانه فصل سرد در محفل اعضای آینه ها و اجتماع سوگوار تجربه های پرید رنگ و این غروبی باور شده از دانش سکوت چگونه می شود به آن کسی که می رود انسان صبور سنگین سرگردان فرمان ایست داد چگونه می شود به مرد گفت که او زنده نیست او هیچ وقت زنده نبوده است. And in translation, that is, on the threshold of a cold season, and in the mirror's grieving vigil, in faint memory's mournful wake, and in this dust pregnant with wise silence, how can one cry stop to one who moves so patiently, heavily, lost? How can one say to this man that he's not alive, that he has never been alive?
That's wonderful. I mean, it sounded wonderful in the Persian. It also sounded wonderful in the translation too. And what you're saying is that you can sort of hear how she uses almost heavy words for single heavy meaning. So you dispense with the sort of rhythm and the meter in order to make content predominant. Is that right? Is that roughly what's going on?
Yes, to some extent. So the most interesting thing about Farroukh is that she doesn't dispense wholly with meter. She retains certain aspects of pre-modern meter despite making all these changes and changing the lengths of the lines. And here she's even splitting poetic feet in half, which is almost unheard of. And this is why, in my opinion, Farroukh takes Persian modernism to its utmost limits, and other poets did not do the same thing. Others went so far as to fall into the realm of prose poetry, but Farroukh retains a connection with the tradition because of her absolute expertise with Persian poetry, both thematically and in terms of metrics.
We've been hearing about Farroukh's rapid rise to fame thanks to her poetry that privileged the female experience, and how, as a divorced woman in the public eye, she attracted intense criticism. Jasmin, her final relationship was no different in that respect.
Yes, she became involved with the film director Ibrahim Golestan. She was first employed as a secretary, I think, and then quickly was acknowledged for her talents and started to make films in his studio. And while she was working with him, they also became involved romantically. It was, as I understand it, an open secret in the circles in which they moved. Golestan was married. Farroukh was divorced by that time. It only seemed to accentuate her reputation as a scandalous or a woman of ill repute, even some, I think, thought of her then. Golestan tended to assert that their relationship was private, and I think that did hurt Farroukh in a lot of ways, that she did seek more acknowledgement from him, but in the society in which they lived in 1950s, 60s Tehran, it was just impossible.
Yes, I was going to ask you about the climate of the time, which led to the level of criticism and this tension that there was about this.
Divorce was exceedingly rare. I think it was at perhaps 2%. It was very, very uncommon for women to get a divorce, in part because almost as a matter of course, they lost custody of their children. So this prevented, and actually now currently does prevent, many Iranian women from seeking a divorce in the first place. So the fact that she had divorced and then She did not apologize for the way she lived. That really irked people.
Sholeh, am I right in thinking that Forroukh's critics used her connection with Golestan to suggest that her success was somehow down to him?
Yes, that was outrageous because in the mid-1960s, Forugh was at the height of her career, but she was still living in a man's world. And many of them considered Forroukh's success as a result of Golestan's intellectual influence on her. And Golestan, in a quote, he said, let me quote, "I can't believe this," he said. "It is unfair. If you give me that kind of credit, then yes, I'll accept, because it is just like acting like a library," he said. "I gave her certain books to read, but everything else she did was her own." So even though he said all that, but of course, women didn't get credit for achievement.
It's clear from what you're all saying how hard she had to fight to get recognition as a poet and be appreciated for her work on its own merits. But at the same time, we can't get away from the fact that her life story, with all its ups and downs, was fascinating. Levi, do you think the focus on her private life overshadowed, and still overshadows, how we read her poetry?
So, of course, her work and biography intersect with each other. People want to read her poetry to have access to that revolutionary potential of her life. And we may do this with all good intentions, but it can lead to a reading that requires us to consider Forroukh's personal life in order to understand her poetry. And the problem with that is that critics don't do this with men who are allowed, maybe even expected, to take on another voice, that of a prophet, visionary, the poet, things like that, for instance. Voices that I think Farrokhzad's poetic persona absolutely does also take on by the end of her life. So I don't know if this is blatant misogyny in doing this sort of reading that connects poetry to autobiography, but I think we can look at it that way when we're only looking at the poetry for the fact that Forugh is a woman, a divorcee, someone is seen as being very risque in her relationships and flaunting the cultural values of the day, which might keep us from making this deeper poetic reading that I think we absolutely could do if we acknowledge that Forroukh's voice may transcend her own life in some cases.
Jasmin, what's your view?
I do agree that her life can be read in a way that overshadows her poetry, but as an Iranian woman, I have to say it matters to me that Forugh was a woman. It matters to me that she was writing from her own life and she didn't make apologies for it. We have such a complicated relationship to her. And part of that is that she died so young at age 32. We have a deep strain of martyrdom in our culture as Iranians. The way we say, "I love you," is to say, "I'll die for you," for example. In the wake of her death, she became almost like a prophet to us. And it's really impossible to see her on her own terms anymore. A lot of people feel that she was too good for her times and that she couldn't have gone on living in the Iran of then, the Iran of now, because she was too good for that society.
Sholeh, what do you think?
Well, Forugh was the first woman in the history of Iran to write completely from a perspective of a woman. Therefore, her personal life is, of course, interesting to us. How did she get there? Why did she arrive at that? But in terms of people accusing her or telling her you're writing a feminine poetry, she said, well, of course my work has aspects of femininity. It's quite natural, she said. Fortunately, I'm a woman, she said. But if you speak of artistic merit, I think gender cannot play a role, she said.
Something just occurred to me. May I add something?
Do. Go ahead.
What I wanted to say is that curiosity about her life can also engender curiosity about her poetry. And I think that's especially true for a non-Iranian reader. I think a reader in America, for example, who encounters her life and learns about the circumstances in which she was writing in Iran, then may be really inspired to go and seek out her poems. And I've had that experience. I've had readers tell me. So I think, again, there is a danger in the life overshadowing, but I think it's also possible for her fascinating life to also open up a space for new readers to encounter her as a poet.
Well, we mentioned a moment ago her work at Golestan's film studios, and that was how she came to direct a documentary called The House is Black. It's been hailed as a forerunner of Iranian New Wave cinema. Levi, can you give us the background to it?
Sure. This is an amazing short documentary film shot in a leper colony outside Tabriz, which is a city in northwestern Iran. And it crosses between ethnography, documentary, and even art house cinema, overlaid with poetry, verses from scripture, the Quran and the Bible that Forugh herself reads, which are juxtaposed and contrasted with a very medical clinical analysis of how leprosy as a disease works, read by Ibrahim Golestan. While she was at the leper colony, too, she met a young boy there named Hossein Mansouri, who she ends up adopting. And some people have seen this as her attempting to make up for the loss of her son that she lost after her divorce. The film is also a major moment in documentary filmmaking in Iran. It's made in 1962. It's clearly moving in a very modernist direction, and it's paving the way for later developments in Iranian cinema.
Can you expand on that a bit? What was it that made it so modernist, and how did it pave the way?
The modernist aspects of it, I would place with the disjointed nature of the film. She's not telling a story. She's just giving us moments from the people who live in the leper colony's lives. And we see flashes of their daily life, flashes of them praying. We get a scene of a wedding where people are celebrating, but it's a very sad film overall because she's showing the abject situation within which these people are living. The approach overall, I think, places this documentary among other modernist films, not just in Iran, but again, as a global phenomenon.
It's the only film over which Forugh had total creative control, and is a window on the kind of work she could have gone on to make. But she was killed in a car accident in Tehran at the age of 32. Jasmin, there are question marks surrounding her death, right?
Many people would say her death was an accident. But I think what, after all, is an accident? It's the last point in a sequence of causal happenings. During her lifetime, Forugh was persecuted, hunted down. There's a certain mythology about how she died in that car crash, that she had actually foreseen her death in her own poetry, that she'd written about it.
I told my mother, this is the end. Before you know it, it shall happen. Let's send my obituary to the papers.
So I also had to enact some of that mythology in the novel itself and embed it within the scene of her death. For me, it was really important, though, that her death not be the major part of her story, that it be one part of a really remarkable life story that happened to end tragically.
And her grave in Tehran has become a shrine, almost.
My understanding is that people still convene there on the anniversary of her death, which was the 14th of February, that they go on her birthday, that on certain days in the past, the authorities have had to lock the cemetery or bar access to her gravesite because so very many people have gathered there. And I think you have a sense from that and from the fact that at protests in 2009 and other moments, Forugh's poems are read. They are still very much a part of people's psyches in Iran.
Faroukh's poetry was banned after the revolution of 1979, the Islamic movement which overthrew the monarchy and brought in a regime to power that governs Iran to this day based on an interpretation of Islam. Sholeh, how is Faroukh's poetry disseminated inside Iran today? Do we know?
Well, after the revolution, when the publisher refused to stop publishing her work, the press was burned down. But gradually, they started circulating her work in the black market, and I believe it is still available in bookstores today, but sometimes it is heavily censored. So when I was translating her work, I was very careful to get the Persian publications from outside of Iran because I could not trust what was published in Iran.
We're coming towards the end of the programme, so to finish with, I'd like to discuss how we should consider Faroukh's legacy, especially in the light of what's happening in Iran today. Did she blaze a trail for women in Iran? Does the prohibition on her work suggest that women's rights have been sidelined more now than in her own time? Or is that too simplistic a view? Levi, what are your thoughts?
So Forugh definitely is a trailblazer for women broadly in Iran, and then also in terms of poetry and the poetic sphere. Her work represents and tracks the development of Persian poetic modernism during her career, and it takes us in her later work to the very end of where Persian modernism can go. And that this is a woman's voice in poetry doing such pioneering things is certainly revolutionary. It's something that perhaps challenges some Western stereotypes about women living in the Middle East or in Iran particularly.
Jasmin.
I think the reason why she has been banned is also a testament to how critically important she still is to Iranians within Iran. I think in some ways her death has also come to represent a certain idea of what Iran might have become, that in the 1960s, Iran was rapidly modernizing, and in the late 70s, it seems that progress from a certain vantage point was arrested. And Faroukh's death feels so emblematic of that rupture, of that premature realization of freedom for Iranians. I think you have a sense from many that if she had lived through the revolution, she would have been executed because she would not have stayed silent. She's tremendously honored, I think, for her bravery, and she continues to inspire us.
Sholeh.
Well, look, Faroukh's poetry is timeless. For me, it's eternal. Why? Because it is multi-layered. You can read it at many, many levels at different points in time. She wrote back then, she said, I abhor people who do all sorts of things contrary to the devout facade they have built, then turn around and screed about societal morality. My God, she's talking about today. She was talking about then. She's talking about now. But one of her last poems, which a lot of people think is a dark poem, I think it's a very, very hopeful poem. She writes, let us believe in the dawn of the cold season. Let us believe in the ruin of imaginary gardens, in idle inverted skies, in confined seeds. Look how it snows. Perhaps truth was those young hands buried beneath snow, and in the coming year, when spring mates with sky behind the window, fountains of green saplings will erupt, saplings that bloom, beloved, my truest friend. Let us believe in the dawn of the cold season. And I think she was relevant then, she is relevant today, and she will be relevant tomorrow.
That's a wonderful place to stop. Thank you so much, Sholeh. And thank you all of you for joining me on the forum, illuminating the fascinating life and beautiful poetry of Forugh Farrokhzad. My guests, Sholeh Wolpé, Jasmin Darznik, and Levi Thompson. I'm Bridget Kendall, and thank you so much for listening.